Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Well, I'm Alicia Vincent, Executive Director of the McGovern Center here at Dakota Wesleyan. On behalf of Partners Against Hunger, DWU, and all of the sponsors for today's event, we'd like to welcome you. Today is the fourth gathering of the South Dakota Hunger Summit. Today is a day for inspiration, motivation, and generosity as we learn from one another, share stories and encouragement to carry on in the fight against hunger, and come together to support others, right here in South Dakota during our Empty Bowls luncheon led by Mitchell High School. We are really glad you're here. Momentarily, Johanna Jensen, sophomore nursing major and student chairperson of today's summit, will introduce the morning's keynote speaker. Following the keynote address, my colleague Carly Hubers will provide additional details about today's agenda and breakout sessions. Again, thank you all for coming. We look forward to the day, and welcome, Johanna.
Our keynote speaker for 2017 is MJ Altman. MJ is the editorial director for the World Food Program USA. She oversees the organization's multimedia projects, op-eds, and communications outreach. She is also the host of the podcast, Hacking Hunger, which dives into stories on the front lines of hunger all over the world. Prior to joining the World Food Program USA, MJ worked as a writer-reporter for the Time magazine in New York, where she covers social justice, politics, and the environment, among other issues. She has also worked in the Smithsonian Institution, where she researched, wrote, and pitched stories about Indigenous history and culture as a public affairs producer. In addition to time in the Smithsonian, her work has been featured on MSNBC, CNN, The Huffington Post, the Associated Press, and National Geographic. Although the Hunger Summit often focuses on South Dakota and issues we face in our local state, today MJ will share her view on the American legacy of global hunger relief and why that matters. Please help me in welcoming MJ Altman.
All right, good morning. Thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you so much for that introduction. As was mentioned, my name is MJ Altman. I'm the editorial director at World Food Program USA. We're a nonprofit that's based in DC that supports the mission of the UN World Food Program. First, again, I really just want to thank you guys so much for inviting us here. It's really an honor to be addressing all of you today. I grew up in a small farming town in Illinois, so my heart will always belong to the heartland, and it's my first time in South Dakota, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm especially honored to be at George McGovern's alma mater. As you know, this native of South Dakota played an enormous part in the fight against hunger here in the U.S. Together with Senator Bob Dole, he helped reform the country's food stamp program, which today feeds 47 million Americans, nearly half of whom are children. He also helped establish WIC, which supports pregnant women and mothers and young children who lack access to good nutrition and health care. And he worked to expand the National School Lunch Program, which feeds 31 million children in schools and child care centers across the country. But what I want to talk about is what Senator McGovern did during his role to feed families across the globe. In his lifetime, he played a pivotal role in helping people in need. In fact, he's considered one of the founding fathers of the UN World Food Program, which is the organization that my nonprofit supports. For those of you who don't know about the World Food Program, it's commonly known by the acronym WFP, and it's the leading humanitarian agency fighting hunger across the globe. Each year, the agency reaches 80 million people in 80 countries around the world, and this includes families in some of the most remote areas and dangerous areas in the entire planet, and that includes Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan. You know, wherever disaster strikes, whether it's conflict or an earthquake or a drought, WFP is among the first aid agencies on the ground to feed people in need. And what's really incredible to me is that the World Food Programme's origins begin right here in the US. In fact, Scott Pelley of CBS called WFP one of the best ideas that America ever had. But before I tell you a little bit more about the World Food Programme and my role at WFP USA, I thought I'd tell you a little bit about myself and how I got involved in the issue of hunger relief and how I became part of this incredible legacy. So my background is actually in journalism. I studied at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and after college, I worked for Time Magazine as a web producer and writer, and I covered a lot of different issues from human rights to the 2008 presidential election. And one of my favorite assignments actually involved producing a special anniversary package on the Iraq War. And as part of that, I examined the conflict through the lens of a variety of different perspectives: a US soldier, an Iraqi aid worker, a US senator, and an Iraqi journalist. And I had the opportunity to interview all of these people and share their unique insights with millions of readers. And it was an incredibly powerful experience for me to really understand the importance of a variety of perspectives. I also saw the real-life impact that storytelling could have, not just for the people that were reading these stories, but actually for the people that I was interviewing. I was writing a story about student loans, actually, which is something I trust a lot of you out here know all too much about. And I interviewed a woman who was actually facing bankruptcy over her daughter's student loan debt. Even though her daughter had never graduated from college, she had actually been killed in a car accident. And after the article was published, this woman called me back and said, after 2 years of unsuccessful calls to the loan company, she had finally received word that her daughter's student loan debt had been forgiven because of the story that I had published. And I think for me, that was the moment that I realized that I wanted to be an advocate for people who couldn't speak truth to power. So I moved to Washington, D.C., and I started working for the Smithsonian's Native American Cultural Center. And as part of this work, I got to interview tribal elders across the U.S. and learn about social issues that were affecting indigenous communities, from poverty and discrimination to teen suicide rates and environmental rights. And that's why I learned about the hunger issues that affect Native American reservations, like Pine Ridge right here in South Dakota. In fact, I got to meet a group of students from Pine Ridge who were visiting the museum and visiting DC on a school trip. And these students told me what it felt like to be treated like charity cases, how it felt to be stereotyped as poor and hungry. And even though they recognized their community's problems, they wanted to be treated with dignity, and they wanted to be empowered to find their own solutions. And they told me about how 60 Minutes had recently done a story on them, and Diane Sawyer had come and visited the reservation. And all of the good intentions aside, these students felt like their community's story had been distorted. And it was a really valuable lesson for me to learn as a journalist, understanding really the responsibility as a storyteller and being inclusive in the process of telling these stories. Then the government shutdown happened in 2013, and I realized I needed to find a job that wasn't subject to the whims of a rather dysfunctional Congress, and that's when I discovered World Food Programme USA. And it is the best job that I've ever had, and it is also the hardest. It's changed how I view everything, but obviously and most especially food and hunger. I mean, no matter where you're from or what language you speak, we all understand food, we all need food, we all interact with it every day. It really does unite us all. And it wasn't until I joined World Food Programme USA that I really understood America's incredible legacy fighting global hunger, both at home and abroad. So one of the best parts about my job is getting to highlight this legacy and share the stories and experiences of people whose voices are not often heard. How this storytelling can inspire action, can change hearts and minds, and share knowledge that we all need. You know, it's really incredible to think about how we have the ability now to communicate with people all over the world. Even in the most remote villages in Africa, you can find cell phones. Basic text messaging technology is how the UN World Food Program is mapping the world's hunger hotspots. It used to be that they would travel door to door on camel with a pencil and pad and ask about food security. And that's how they did it as recently as 2010. So it really gives you an appreciation of how this communications technology has changed the way that the UN World Food Program has worked. I mean, we're more connected now than ever before, and this means that sharing stories and sharing perspectives is easier today than ever before in human history. At the same time, the rise of technology has coincided with a rise in global conflict and mass displacement. In fact, right now, the world is facing unprecedented levels of hunger and humanitarian need. For the first time in a decade, the number of hungry people in the world is going up. This was just announced a couple of months ago, and conflict is the main cause. Earlier this year, there's an example. The UN formally declared famine in parts of South Sudan. This is the first time in my 4 years with World Food Program USA that famine has ever been declared. And at a time when technology and tools exist to fight global hunger and we have the solutions, such mass starvation is really a paradox, and it's entirely preventable. So aid workers in the aftermath of this famine declaration launched a massive humanitarian response to reverse this famine in South Sudan, and it worked for now. But famine is still looming as I speak in South Sudan, along with Yemen, Somalia, and Nigeria. And these disasters are almost entirely man-made, and they are fundamentally political failures, not humanitarian ones. Since the beginning of the conflict in South Sudan, the World Food Program and its partners have warned of the limits that humanitarian aid can bring in replace of peace and political stability. And we now are seeing the consequences of those limits. South Sudan is actually the world's youngest nation. Yet ever since independence was declared in 2011, fighting has forced millions of people to flee to neighboring countries like Uganda. And last fall, I actually heard a BBC journalist from Uganda talking about this refugee crisis in his country. And he actually spoke on the 1-year anniversary of the death of Aylan Kurdi. This was the Syrian boy whose image lying face down and lifeless on the shores of Turkey became a horrific symbol. I see some of you guys nodding, remembering it, a horrific symbol of the ongoing conflict in Syria. And Aylan's family was escaping violence in Syria, and yet this escape ended in tragedy, and he was just 3 years old. So this BBC journalist that I saw last fall turned to the audience and said, "That child could have been me." This journalist, his name was Alan Kasuja, was a refugee himself growing up. And his family had also fled violence when he was a child, and they also relied on humanitarian assistance from the World Food Program to survive. And what was interesting is, as Alan Kasuja talked about, how many of Uganda's current government leaders were once refugees like him. And that's why they understand better than most politicians what the needs of refugees are. It's why his country, Uganda, has welcomed more refugees than any other sub-Saharan nation. In fact, more refugees fled into Uganda last year than crossed the Mediterranean, even though refugees fleeing to Europe received far more media coverage. And it's untold perspectives like these that show why storytelling matters. Without the shared knowledge about this need, support often falls short. Just last August, there was another image of a Syrian child that ricocheted around the world, and I was hesitant to show the actual image, so this is actually a sketch. I don't know if you guys remember this. This was the image of a Syrian child in the back of an ambulance in Aleppo. And this little boy's name is Omran, and he was just 5 years old when that photo was taken. And his is another example, I think, of an image and a story that can stop people in their tracks and remind them about, that there are actual individuals that are caught up in this conflict. It's not an abstract war. Also, I wanted to show this image of a woman named Fatma. She's a Syrian refugee who told a World Food Program staffer how she actually ties scarves around her child's belly to try to stop the hunger pains. And this woman, she was actually resettled in Canada this year after living in a tent in Lebanon for nearly 4 years. And it's these kind of individual stories that I think can sometimes get lost when we're talking about global hunger. I'm reminded of the baby that I met in Tanzania 3 years ago in a hospital in one of the country's most remote regions, where mothers have to walk sometimes a full day just to reach the nearest hospital. This baby was just 10 months old, and he was dying of severe acute malnutrition. So his lips were actually stained blue with iodine to treat the mouth sores that had developed from being deprived of nutrition for so long. In fact, he had gone without nutrition for so long, he could no longer process food, and there was nothing that doctors could do. And in a region where many mothers don't name their children right away because infant mortality rates are so high, this mother had courageously given this 10-month-old boy a name, Kelvin. So when I met this woman and her son, the only thing that the doctors told this mother that she could do was to wait for his suffering to end. A journalist that works for the Wall Street Journal once described looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger as a disease of the soul. And he was right. That image of Kelvin and his mother in remote Tanzania will haunt me for the rest of my life, and it should. That child's death was entirely preventable and a failure of the international community in many ways. And these are the consequences of food insecurity. But as you guys know, fighting hunger is so much more than just delivering food. It's about empowering communities with the tools and the training and the support they need to feed themselves. It means evolving our understanding of what food assistance looks like and what food assistance can be. So for the World Food Program, that means providing, in some cases, digital food cards instead of traditional food rations, so that families can have access to fresher, more diverse diet of dairy, meat, and produce instead of the traditional rations of grains and fortified cooking oil. And this approach, it not only saves costs, but it also restores a sense of dignity and choice for refugees that have lost so much else. I want you to look at this photo of a Syrian family living in Zatri, which is now the world's second largest refugee camp, and it's located in Jordan. And this refugee family is gathered around a warm meal that the mother cooked with fresh ingredients that she was able to purchase using WFP's digital food cards. We all know the comfort that comes with a home-cooked meal. Now imagine how important that meal becomes when you've been forced to flee your home, maybe forever. For WFP, it also means helping poor farmers harvest more crops and store them better. It means connecting these same farmers with local schools to create homegrown school meals. And this approach is wonderful because it lifts farmers out of poverty by providing a reliable market, while at the same time nourishing children in need and helping them succeed in the classroom and creating a sustainable supply chain where these communities can help themselves. So I actually met one of these farmers this summer in Cambodia. This man, he's a father of 3 named Yoon, and he's here with one of his daughters. And he actually grows fresh cucumbers, spinach, and melons that are used to feed his children and her classmates in school. And he told me how proud he is knowing that this hard work on his farm is growing food and nourishing his children and his community, and how incredible that is that he is able to do that with his hands, to make such a difference. So I think what my time at World Food Program USA has taught me is that food really is the most basic building block. And US politicians on both sides of the aisle have long recognized the importance of fighting hunger. In fact, ever since the World Food Program's founding in 1961, the US has been by far the most generous supporter for the World Food Program's work. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, it's because of the US, it's because of leaders and lawmakers here that the World Food Program even exists. In 1947, when President Truman made his first ever live televised broadcast from the White House, he chose to talk about hunger and the food shortages that were ravaging Europe in the aftermath of World War II. In 1954, President Eisenhower created the landmark program that is today known as Food for Peace. And it was based on one simple but really powerful idea, which is to support US interests abroad by providing surplus US crops to countries in need around the world. George McGovern became this program's first director, and he was the one who actually suggested creating the World Food Program. 7 months later, in 1961, the UN General Assembly established WFP. And that same year, JFK told the world, food is strength, food is peace, and food is freedom, and food is a helping hand to people around the world whose goodwill and friendship we want. And I think it's really incredible that 50 years later, those words still ring true today. Even after Senator McGovern retired, he remained devoted to fighting hunger, as you guys all know. In 2002, he and Senator Dole established the McGovern-Dole International Fund for Food and Education. And so far, this has fed 22 million children in 41 countries, which is amazing. And in recognition of this, Senators Dole and McGovern were together awarded the World Food Prize in 2008. And even today, this bipartisan legacy continues. Republican Senator Pat Roberts from Kansas wrote last year, "Show me a nation that cannot feed itself, and I'll show you a nation in chaos." As Senator Roberts knows, the well-being of all nations begins with good nutrition. Another native South Dakotan, former US Senator Tom Daschle, told me earlier this year, hunger is an issue that affects all of us, whether directly or indirectly. And he also told me about the moral imperative to fight hunger. It's the right thing to do. It's the humanitarian thing to do. He said, if you believe at all in the Bible or any religious teaching, it's probably the most relevant lesson of Christianity and of most religions today. And Senator Daschle also laid out a very practical reason for caring about global hunger, saying if you don't visit a bad neighborhood, that bad neighborhood will one day visit you. You're going to be affected by what happens in Syria one way or another. You're going to be affected by what happens in Malawi one way or another. And as Senator Daschle was pointing out, hunger feeds on violence and instability, and you can see the consequences right now in places like Syria and South Sudan and Yemen. Right now, more than half of Syria's entire population is displaced, and 3/4 of the entire population require humanitarian assistance. According to the World Food Program, 6,000 people in Syria are displaced every single day. Globally, there are more displaced people in the world than there has been since World War II. And for that reason, food assistance and food security and humanitarian aid from the World Food Program is one of the most stabilizing forces on the planet right now. Without the legal right to work and put food on the table, millions of refugees must instead rely on food from WFP. And this is the everyday reality of mothers like Fatma, who I showed you, and children like Omran. So as part of my work at World Food Program USA, we launched a podcast to bring these voices to life. It's called Hacking Hunger. And our goal is really to share these stories that you don't often hear. We want to make sure that when people think about global hunger and these enormous humanitarian crises, that they don't think about just abstract statistics, that they remember the actual people involved. So as part of this project, I've had the chance to interview aid workers and displaced people, and people who are both, actually. I'm going to show you a photo of a woman named Afra. And she's actually a displaced woman in Syria who also serves as an aid worker for WFP. And Afra told me about being held hostage last year by militants near an ISIS-controlled territory in the country's northeast, and being rescued by the very same community that she serves for the World Food Program. This is an incredibly unique and powerful perspective, and not one that you often hear about, someone who is an aid worker and who is also displaced. And because Turkey decided to close its border near where she works, WFP staffers like her now struggle to deliver humanitarian assistance to families that live there. And on a personal level, this border closure means that Afra can no longer visit her family who have fled across the border into Turkey. So all of you are here because you know how hunger affects everyday people here in South Dakota and families far away in South Sudan. Hunger is a local and a global issue. You can just ask the farmers in the Midwest whose grain is being shipped overseas to prevent famine in Yemen, or talk to the US military vet who has witnessed firsthand how important humanitarian aid can be on the front lines of war. Or you can talk to the refugee who has found hope and opportunity by resettling in the US after surviving the horrors of violence and persecution. You know, I think this is an incredibly exciting and scary time to be working on the issue of global hunger. The world is changing faster than ever before, and very soon the young people in this room will be the leaders of that world. You're already shaping the future, and right now you have to decide how. Even if you don't work for the UN or for a nonprofit like World Food Program USA, no matter what skill or passion you have, you can apply it to make the world a better place, and you can help solve hunger. You can be a journalist or a photographer or a filmmaker and share the stories of people affected by hunger. You can be a lawyer and fight for human rights and equality and access to nutrition. You can be a business leader who practices corporate social responsibility and encourages your consumers to give back. Or you can build smartphone apps like WFP's Share the Meal, which actually helps feed children in emergencies. Or you could become a farmer like my grandpa, harvesting life from death and decay, and maybe even using your market power and surplus crops to feed families in need. There's a term that we like to use to describe the young generation right now. The zero hunger generation is what we like to describe people today, today's youth. And the reason we're called the zero hunger generation is that UN hopes to completely eradicate hunger by 2030. And experts believe that it's possible to get quite close to that goal. If the UN can succeed, all of you young people in this room will be the reason. Journalist Nick Kristof pointed out recently in the New York Times, in your lifetime, we have a decent chance of virtually wiping out ills that have plagued humanity for thousands of generations, from illiteracy to the most devastating kind of hand-to-mouth poverty. I hope this idea motivates all of you to rise to the occasion as you move forward in your life and your career. You know, every year we give out an award to recognize the people who continue the incredible legacy of Senator George McGovern. And here's actually an image from our award the first year that I joined World Food Program USA, and Senator Bob Dole was that year's recipient. And he joked that he and Senator McGovern would argue all day on the floor of the Senate about Vietnam, and then spend their evening discussing how to fight hunger over dinner. And I love that idea of that bipartisanship, that hunger transcends politics. It's something that we can all get behind and support. And during this year's award ceremony, the recipient for this year, a lawmaker from Kansas, actually, during his acceptance speech, talked about the importance of making the issue of hunger feel real for those of us who are fortunate enough to have food on our tables. And he emphasized why it's important to keep sharing these stories of people affected by hunger, to make it resonate, how we must appeal to both the head and the heart when we're talking about something as enormous as this. So as we kick off this year's summit, I'm reminded once again of the importance of continuing the legacy of hunger heroes like George McGovern. Our progress going forward will depend on people like all of you in this room, and individuals like Fatma and Afra and Omran are counting on the dedication and generosity of individuals here. You are truly the world's zero hunger heroes. In my short time that I've been here in South Dakota, I've had the chance to talk to a couple of you, and I'm just so impressed by the passion and the intelligence and the curiosity that you bring to this issue. In fact, I had the chance to talk to one young student, Cece, and she was gracious enough to pick us up last night from the Sioux Falls airport pretty late. And on our drive here to Mitchell, she was telling my colleague Ash and I about an incredible school garden project in Uganda that Dakota Wesleyan made possible. And I loved hearing about this project and all of the care and the consideration and the passion that went into it, how the crops were carefully selected for dietary diversity and growing conditions, how the community was involved every step of the way to make sure that it felt like a local project, and how after just 1 year of this school garden, crop yields were higher than expected, and nearly 90% of the students in this school in Uganda are receiving these homegrown school meals. It sounds corny, but meeting young people like Cece really, it gives me hope for the future and for our fight against global hunger. So before I leave you guys, I wanted to leave you with this image. And this is one of my favorite photographs. It's one that I found shortly after I joined World Food Program USA. It was taken at a refugee camp in Uganda, and this woman fled her home carrying her baby on foot the entire way, and she was fleeing violence in Darfur. And when she arrived at the border of Uganda, she was greeted with a warm meal from the World Food Program. And I just love the look on her face. To me, I don't think you see that this woman has fled such violence and horrific conflict that most of us will hopefully never have to experience. What I take from this photo is that you can see that she feels safe and that her child is safe and that she has a roof over her head, clothes on her back, and food at hand, a bag of grain stamped with the US flag. To me, this picture illustrates one of the most powerful, life-saving legacies of our country, America's leadership addressing global hunger. It's one that should make us all proud, and one that I hope the next generation of leaders in this room will fight to preserve. Thank you.